Well, hello everybody. Thank you very much for joining me this evening. It's lovely to have you all, and I appreciate it's very early for some of you, perhaps in Australia and late in different places. So yeah, I will hopefully make this kind of worth your while, spending the next hour or so here. As Martin was saying, so what this session is about is talking about preparing to write a novel and the main keys for kind of novel writing success. So whether you're thinking about doing NaNoWriMo, whether that's coming up, whether you're thinking about kind of joining our writing course, whether you think about just kind of writing a novel more generally, wherever you're at in the writing process and in your writing journeys. This should give you some advice and tips in terms of how to start and think about planning before you begin to write. Got the presentation here. Brilliant. Okay, so yeah, as I said, we're going to talk about the 5 keys to success, and what I think are the 5 key elements to think about before you start getting down to write. So I'm going to do a brief introduction first, tell you a little bit about my background, who I am, why I'm here, and then I'm going to talk about what I call the 5 Ps, which are the pitch, the protagonist, the plot, the point of view, and the place. I think these are the 5 elements to think about and do your prepping and planning before you get down to write the novel properly. And then once I've done the presentation, then we'll have plenty of time to ask questions on any of these topics. So I'll begin, I think, with talking a little bit about introductions. I'll tell you a little bit about who I am and my own particular background. Introductions, here we go. There's a picture of me. So I have worked in publishing for almost 25 years. Yes, quite a long time now. So I started work originally as a bookseller. I always think that if you're interested working in publishing and even writing as well, a job in a bookseller is one of the most useful kind of practical things you can do. And from that, I got a job as a copywriter. So I was the guy who wrote all the blurbs on the back of the books. That was my kind of starting job in publishing. From there, I went on to become a commissioning editor, an editorial director and publisher at different kind of publishing houses. And in total, I've commissioned and edited over 100 titles, a whole range, including bestsellers, including kind of prize winners, fiction and non-fiction. And at the same time as doing the editing, I've also worked as an author. So I've written and co-written a dozen books of my own. These are both kind of fiction and non-fiction. And over the last 10 years or so, I've also worked more as a ghostwriter. So here I've written around 15 books, and again, these include kind of prize winners and international top 10 bestsellers, mainly memoir. That tends to be what I work in. A whole range of subjects, a whole range of kind of celebrities. I have signed enough non-disclosure agreements. I can't tell you any of the people who I've worked with, but it's a really interesting job, and I've worked with fascinating individuals over my time. And at the same time, the other string to my bow is that I teach novel writing. So I've done this for about a decade. And last year I joined Reedsy as head of learning, and the main thrust of that in the beginning is to launch our How to Write a Novel course, which began in September. And I'll talk a little bit about that towards the end of the presentation as well. So that is me, but let's move on. Oh no, we'll move on in a second. I just wanted to show you this slide quickly, which is an example of some of my previous students who've gone on to publish. I think in total I've had about 30 or 40 students who've gone on to have kind of publishing deals. So Joanna Cannon here on the left was a huge kind of literary bestseller here in the UK. Deborah Masson won the Bloody Scotland Crime Debut Novel of the Year. It's a kind of dark crime series she's writing set in the north of Scotland. Asia Mackay, who is a comedy writer. So this was a book about a new mother who had a secret life as a spy, and that was the runner-up in the Comedy Women in Print Awards. And then most recent this year, Alice Chow, A.Y. Chow, whose debut novel, Shanghai Immortal, was a #1 Sunday Times bestseller here in the UK and has just been published, I think, in the US as well. So a complete spread of people. I just wanted to show you that to give you a sense of, so different people who've done my course and what they've gone on to do. And all those people are exactly like you are now. When they started their journeys, they had hopes and dreams and ambitions and an idea for a book. And it worked. I think it's always quite instructive and quite inspiring to know that those people are there, and it does happen. I've seen these people go from the first sentence through to the bestseller list, so it can and it does happen. So have that faith and belief that it could happened to you. Okay, but in order to write your book before you start, you need to think about kind of preparation. And what I'm going to focus in on this evening is what I call the 5 Ps of preparation. A nice little bit of illustration here, and these 5 Ps are as follows. So firstly, the pitch. I think that's the first element to kind of think about. Secondly, the role of the protagonist, and we'll do that before the third element, which is the plot. And then the last two, which I think are also important, the point of view and also the tense that you're writing in. And then finally, to think a little bit about the place and the setting of your novel as well. So I'm going to talk through each of these in turn, and if you've got any questions at the end, we can go through and discuss. But I'm going to begin by talking about the pitch. Now, what is the pitch? It's sometimes called the elevator pitch. I think that's where the term came from originally, from an American business book in the early 1970s. And the idea was that if you are in a lift with a potential buyer for your product, that you've got your pitch there ready to show, and you can do that sale up straight and have that there at your fingertips. So that's where the idea of a pitch comes from. In terms of a novel, it is more about coming up with a short single sentence summary of what your book is about. And as you might guess from its origins, it is important later on in the writing process as a selling tool. So whether it's the line that you put in your covering letter when you're writing to an agent or a publisher, it might be the line that you use on your kind of Amazon blurb, it might be the line on the back of the book where you're trying to get someone to buy the book. So all those points, it's useful to have the pitch there. But here, I think it's a really important element to have for the writing process. And you might be thinking, why should you be thinking about a sales line here at the start? And I think don't think of it as a sale line at this point. It's thinking about helping the writing process. And I always think that the sharper and clearer you can make that pitch, the smoother a writing journey you'll have. And I've certainly seen, books from the sales point of view where it's got a clear selling point and it works in terms of going to the bookshop, in terms of going to the booksellers and going to the readers. But in terms of the writing as well, if you can clarify in a single sentence what your book is about, that will stand you in such good stead for the writing. And I think one of the reasons for that is because it really forces you to think about what the book is about at its heart. Because if you've got 100 words to describe your book or 200 words to describe your book, you've got plenty of space and you can waffle away and add in this, that, and the other. If you've got a single sentence, you've got to decide and make a decision, okay, this is the most important thing in the book. And I think when you know that, it really helps, firstly, to focus your mind, but secondly, when you are writing and you get stuck or you think, I'm not sure where this is going, you can use it as an aid memoir to go back to think about, okay, is this particular chapter linking up to what the book is about? So the more that you can come up with that pitch, the more that you can think about it, then you can have this line to work with. And as I say here, every time you're unsure or unstuck over what it is you're working on, you'll be able to refer back to this to remind you. I always say to my students, actually, if you've got, you've got that on a Post-it note and you can look up to it and think, okay, how does this chapter add to this central point of the story? And if it's not adding, then maybe the book is going off in the wrong direction, that little particular point. So what makes for a good pitch? I think it's about a number of things. I think firstly, a pitch for me is about story. It's not about what the theme of the book is, as interesting as that might be. It's not about, how you're telling it. You might have multiple points of views and flashbacks and this, that, and the other. It's about the story and focusing on what is driving the plot. And what tends to drive the plot for me is conflict. You need conflict there at the heart of what it is you're writing to get that dramatic tension into the story. And that conflict, I think, is one that should be one where the outcome is unclear. I think that is kind of really, really important. If there's a conflict, but it's fairly obvious how it's going to end up, then the dramatic tension is lessened. So you want a conflict at the heart of your story, of your novel, but one where it's uncertain. how that's going to play out at the end. A couple more things. Firstly, and I'm going to talk about this again in a moment. Stories are about change. I think that is a crucial element of writing, whether it's plot, whether it's character, and if you can get that element of change into the pitch, so much the better. I would say. And then finally, I always think that pitches are best when they are specific rather than general. If you can get those little details in there, whether it's character names, whether it's setting, those specifics in there, again, just make your story more individual and unique. And it's not an easy thing to do, writing this pitch. If you've got 20, 25 words maximum, that's hard. It might actually be one of the hardest sentences that you write in the whole process of writing the book, but it's the one that probably will be the most beneficial and the most useful if you get it right. And I just want to give you one very quick example about the difference between a pitch, which I think is quite general and doesn't have conflict, to one where it works. And the example I'm going to give you is a classic kind of romance pitch, a story of boy meets girl, boy and girl fall in love, get married, and live happily ever after. Now, this is a story. There is a narrative there. There's a progression. There is a beginning, a middle, and an end. But hopefully you can see there's no conflict or any tension in that story. It's all too smooth and too easy. So here are just a couple of sort of reworkings of that I think make the same story kind of more interesting. Boy meets girl. Boy and girl go their different ways. Boy and girl meet up years later, now with different people, but still with feelings for each other. Now, this immediately to me feels a more interesting story. And in terms of what I was saying about that question of outcome and conflict, it's less clear. Are they going to stay with the people they're with now, or are those feelings going to take over and they're going to go back to the person who they fell in love with in the first place? So there, I think that outcome is uncertain. And to give you one more example, boy meets girl. Boy's family wants him to marry a different girl and will disown him if he doesn't. So here you've got conflict, you've got choice, okay? There's going to be consequences in terms of what his decision is. Is he going to choose his family, or is he going to choose, the love of his life? That is a tension there. That's a conflict at the heart of the story, and hopefully you can see that both those examples at the bottom are better, stronger pitches. There's something intriguing in there, and as a reader, you're thinking, I'm not sure how this is going to play out, but I want to read on and find out what that conclusion is. So yeah, so the pitch I would say is the first thing to think about out of the piece. The second one, which I think is really important, is to think about your protagonist. Your main kind of central character, and having that person fleshed out in detail before you start, I think is kind of really, really useful for a number of reasons. Sometimes kind of students ask me, which is more important, which comes first? Is it the plot or the character? And I always think this is a slightly false question for me, because in a good novel, the relationship is slightly different. Rather than one being more important than the other, in fact, they're symbiotic. That their roles are kind of interlinked with each other. And in a good novel, I think that the protagonist should shape the plot, and the plot should shape the protagonist. It should be this kind of two-way process where each of them are having this effect on the other. Yes, as I said there. And I think personally, if I had to choose out the two, my usual recommendation is to focus on the characters first. I think sometimes there's lots of books out there on how to write plots, and people get stuck into thinking about the plots, and sometimes the characters get forgotten. And actually, I think in a way the character is the more influential, perhaps, is one way of saying it, of the two elements. And I so often find with students that when people get stuck with the story, or they're not sure where it's going, the answer to plot problems 9 times out of 10 in my experience isn't to do with adding in more plot or challenges with the plot. The answer lies in getting to know the characters better. So usually if you've got a plot problem, it means that you don't know your characters well enough. And if you can go back through, get to know your characters in a bit more detail, then more often than not, that will answer your kind of plot problem. So the more that you can get to know your characters before you start, and that protagonist in particular, the more that will benefit the writing. I think the most important element, if we go on to the next slide, is this question of character motivation. And I think the key detail to know about your characters and about your protagonist in particular is their wants and their needs. And you might be here thinking, okay, what's the difference between the wants and the needs? And I think it's one slightly deeper than the other. So a want, or what the character thinks they want, should really drive the first half of the narrative, and then that character need is something deeper and more fundamental, and that should shape the second. And I think when you've got those elements there, that underpins who that character is, and as a result, it underpins the kind of narrative as well. There is that kind of relationship between the two, and when I go on to talk about plot in a second, you'll be able to kind of see that a little bit more. And I think I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of wants and needs, because I think sometimes it's fine for me to say this, but what does it actually mean in practice? So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. So the first one, a character might want to be famous. That might be their initial goal driving them in the first half, but what they really need is to be heard. So it's a false goal they're aiming for to start, and then they understand, what it is that actually more fundamentally they need. Second example, a protagonist might want to get married, but what they really need is love, not necessarily the same thing. Comment on my own relationships, but anyway, yeah, it can be different things. And then the third one here, a character might want to see the world, but what they really need is a home. And hopefully you can see with each of those examples and the way I'm talking, is that in the widest, most fundamental sense, you're beginning to see a story and a story arc there, and I'll talk about that again in a second when we get onto plot. And as I say here, if you've got the wants and needs clear in your mind, then that creates a structure that is character embedded for your story to follow. And those for me are the narratives and novels that are the strongest when that occurs. So let's move on to the third P, which is the plot. And I think when you're planning the book, one of the questions is how much plotting to do in advance. And you may well have heard this debate amongst writers between planners and pantsers, sort of between writers who plan before they start writing and planners who focus in, will write by the seat of their pants. They don't want to plan in advance. They want it to be, a surprise and a journey and an experience as they write. I think in reality, rather than it being an either-or thing, it's a kind of sliding scale, and every writer is different. So one of the keys for you as a writer is to work out how much planning you need in order to be comfortable to start to write. And I've just got a couple of quotes here from different writers to give you a sense of this kind of spectrum of planning. So Ian Rankin, for example, fantastic Scottish crime writer, says, I have the feeling that if I knew what was going to happen in a story, I wouldn't need to write the story. I've never regretted not plotting. So he's at one end of the spectrum. At the opposite end would be a writer like William Boyd, the literary writer. And he says, it takes me about 3 years to write a novel, and I spent roughly 2 years figuring it out, and 1 year writing it. So there, for him, the balance is much more in the planning before the writing, and he has to do all that before he gets started. Ian Rankin, I should say, writes more books than William Boyd, perhaps unsurprisingly. Most writers, I think, end up somewhere in the middle between these kind of two extremes. So Patricia Highsmith, a classic crime writer who I love, in one book said, for her, a plot should never be a rigid thing in the reader's mind when he starts to work. I like surprises myself. If I know everything that's going to happen, it is not so much fun writing it. And in her book, Plotting and Writing Suspense Fiction, she talks about plotting up to a certain point, so say the first 120 pages or something, and then keeping it open after that. So she does a bit of plotting and planning, but then lets it kind of flow out from there. And as I say, there's no right and wrong in how much plotting to do. It's working out what will drive you. Will you feel more comfortable writing if you've got that planning and preparation done in the background, or will you feel more energized if you've got that freedom to explore and see where it goes? So find your place on the spectrum, and don't listen to people who say you must do it like this or you must do it like that. Um, these are just some of the many how-to plot books. As I said earlier, in a strange way, there's very few books on writing character, but a lot on plot. So probably the starting point is Joseph Campbell's book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, which was famously used by George Lucas when he wrote kind of Star Wars, which delved into a lot of myths and legends and came up with these different archetypes. Christopher Vogler's The Writer's Journey, you may have heard of. Christopher Booker's The Seven Basic Plots divides all stories down into seven different kind of main plots. And then more recently, books like Save the Cat writes a novel is there as well. There's lots out here to read and explore. Personally, I'm always slightly kind of wary of using these. And there's another book on storytelling by Will Stall called The Science of Storytelling, which I really like. And he always says that these recipes work, but the problem with recipes is that every time you follow one, you get the same bloody cake. And certainly over the years of having taught kind of novel writing, I've seen so many books where I can see the joins of the writer's journey, and I think, okay, I can see they followed that formula or that structure. And so I think for me, and certainly on the novel course when I teach, I'm less interested in those models and structures. And I think what's more useful are two things. Firstly, to go back to the books that you love and have a think about why those work. I think that's the first thing to say. And then secondly, to think about plotting principles. I think that for me is the starting point. And if you can get those principles right, then you can flesh out the novel in a fresher, more individual and distinct way. I'm doing lots of alliteration this evening. I apologise for that. So we've done the five P's. We've got the three C's here. And the three C's, when you're plotting for me, are the first one is change. I mentioned this earlier. And Will Storr, again, in his book, says a more creatively freeing way of looking at plot is as a symphony of change. And this is this idea, I suppose, not on the biggest level, that when you're writing a novel, your protagonist should be a different person at the end of the book to who they are at the beginning. That should be the starting point. But that idea of change is sort of embedded throughout the story. It's not just changing character, it's changing circumstance and in situation, in terms of plot. It's on a bigger picture level, it's on a smaller level as well. And two of the things that we talk about in detail on the course, which I think are crucial, are these ideas of kind of change and movement. And the more that you can get those embedded into the story, the stronger the novel and the narrative will be. The second of my three C's is causality. And this is all about kind of creating links. And I've got a quote here from Ian Forster's book, Aspects of the Novel, which I always think is the best description I've come across on this. And he says that a plot is a narrative of events, the emphasis falling on causality. The king died and then the queen died of grief is a story. Sorry, that's wrong actually. The king died and then the queen died is a story. The king died and then the queen died of grief is a plot. The time sequence is preserved, but the sense of causality overshadows it. So just to repeat, that's error on the script. I apologise for that. So the king died and then the queen died is a story. The king died and then the queen died of grief is a plot. And where plots work best is where you've got this sequence of events that happen in one causally linked chain. They can only happen in one particular sequence, and when those are in place, then the plot is tight. If you can look at your plot and you can move things around, then that narrative isn't kind of tight and kind of taut enough. So thinking about the element of causality, I think is crucial. And then the third element after change and causality is complications. So going back to Patricia Highsmith again, she says that the improvement of thickening of a plot is the piling on of complications for the hero, or perhaps for his enemies. If the writer can thicken the plot and surprise the reader, the plot is logically improved. And I think that's really, really important. To make your character grow and change, you have to make life difficult for them. So the more complications, the more things you can throw in their way, the more they are forced to think about who they are, the more choices they have to make, the more difficult choices with consequences they have to make. And as a result, they change as kind of individuals. So those three elements are crucial. And I'm just going to show you how all this fits in together on the next slide. With what I was talking before about character. So my recommendation is to start with character change. So thinking that your protagonist should be a different person at the end of the novel to who they are at the beginning. And this, for me, comes through that idea, as I was talking before, about wants and needs. And I think you can use these character motivations as an overarching kind of framework for your narrative. And it sort of plays out like this. So you've got your protagonist at the start, has their initial goal, they want or they think they want X. And then the first half of the novel is them searching for X. You get to the middle, the kind of the midpoint, and you have this moment where the protagonists realize that X isn't enough, and they learn that actually what they really more fundamentally need is Y. So you have this switch of motivation, switch of goals. The protagonist attempts to achieve Y. That's the second half of the book. And then the conclusion is where the protagonist finally achieves Y. It's quite a simple structure, that, but I think it gives you a sort of umbrella framework, whether you are a planner or a pantser. It gives you that overall shape, that direction of travel as to where you think that the book is going or should be going. So if you've got that in there, I think that's kind of very, very effective. If you're a planner, you may want to then flesh that framework out. And I would say this is about plotting out a chapter by chapter plan under this framework. But depending on how much detail you want to go into, you can either have that, that umbrella and leave it at that, or you can go down in a more granular level and have the points there kind of plot by plot. If you're doing that, I would stress test with the enforcer's idea of causality. Just check that those links in the chain are strong. And if it feels lacking at any point, add in these complications that I was talking about. And as I was saying earlier, make life hard for your protagonists. They can put their feet up at the end of the book by making them make choices, and difficult choices, and choices with consequences. It forces them to choose, and it forces them to change. And if you think back to that pitch I was saying earlier about the boy whose family was saying, you've got to choose between marrying this person or being disowned. That is a difficult choice, and a choice with consequences. And that's what good fiction, I think, at its heart is about. So I think, as I say, there's lots of books out there about plot, but for me, thinking about those sort of first principles with plotting is the way to start. And in particular, think about how those are related to the protagonist. And if you get the plot and the protagonist pulling together, that's when the novels are at their strongest for me. Okay, we've done three. We've got two to go on our P's. So the fourth for me is point of view, and I think this is an important thing to think about from a practical point of view. And I'm talking here about both point of view and also the tense that you tell your story from. And the reason this is important is that it's such a big job to change. I mean, I speak from experience myself. If you start writing a novel in the first person, and then 15,000, 20,000 words in, you realize that's wrong and it's in third person, it is an absolutely horrible job going back to unpick. It's thankless, it's time consuming, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone. So if you can make that decision before you start and stick to it, you're going to save yourself a lot of time and grief later on. And I think it's true with point of view. It's also true with tense as well. So both of these are choices to think about at the start. I think it's worth saying with both these choices that there's no right or wrong in what you choose. I think all these options, the ones I'm going to kind of lay out in a second, have positives and negatives. So that the two questions I always say to think about when you are thinking about plot, thinking about some point of view, and thinking about the tense, are these two questions. So firstly, what is the best viewpoint and tense for the particular story I want to tell? And some viewpoints and some tenses will be more suited than others. And secondly, and I think this is really important, what is the viewpoint and tense that I, as a writer, feel most comfortable in writing in? For me as a writer, I tend to prefer writing in first person. I know that that's my kind of natural viewpoint I will write in. So I would have to think quite carefully if I was writing a book in third person, because it would be a more difficult thing for me to do. And I think one of the things you can do at the start is to write out, a sample scene and write it in different tenses and different points of views, and see which feels the best fit for you and for your story. I'm just going to show you on the next couple of slides uh, a few advantages and disadvantages. So I would say with point of view, there are lots of points of view out there. I'm going to focus in on the two that I think most novels are written in, which is first person and what we call third person close. And third person close is when you are, I would describe it as like Long John Silver's parrot. You're with the viewpoint of one particular character. You can see into their thoughts, rather than being a more omniscient viewpoint where you can see to everybody's thoughts. I mean, there are other viewpoints out there, but as I say, the majority of novels are written in these two viewpoints, so these are the ones I'm going to focus on. In terms of first person, these are the advantages. I think as a way of telling, it's more intimate. It's easier to get inside that character's voice, and that's the second point. You can bring out the voice of that character and the voice of the book more easily. And sometimes you will find that different agents and publishers talk about the importance of voice, and first person is definitely a helpful way of getting that in the writing. I think also that first person is easier to manipulate the reader. If you're that kind of writer who wants to have an unreliable narrator, you're with this character all the time, so it's easier to kind of steer the reader, in a certain direction. The disadvantages or the challenges of first person is, firstly, I think as a viewpoint, it can feel a little bit claustrophobic. You're stuck with this character throughout, and that can be a bit confining. If the reader doesn't like that character, are they going to carry on if they're going to stuck with them for the next 200, 300 pages? It creates challenges sometimes with plotting. You have to find a way to get this character into every scene, even if they're not naturally kind of coming into that moment. It can be more difficult to get other voices into the writing, and there can be limitations with the character as well. So, for example, if you're writing from the point of view of a child, that might be difficult in bringing in bigger, deeper themes in the novel. Or if your character is, I don't know, a football hooligan, say, then it might be harder to write, the nice bits of description, because that character wouldn't be thinking in that way about how places look. Or I might be being unfair to football hooligans there, but I think you probably get the point. In terms of third person close, the switch is sort of the opposite, really. So the positives are you've got that little bit more space in the telling as opposed to the first person, and that certainly helps with things like description. It's easier to do. You've got more choice, I think, as a protagonist. It's easy to switch scene from character to character, so that could be useful in terms of kind of plotting, getting different voices in there, and it can be useful, as I say, in switching between protagonists. And then the challenges of third person, again, are sort of the opposite of first person. So it's a lack of intimacy. It's a slightly more distance telling if you're not careful. And I think there's a danger of using the third person to be more kind of old-fashioned telling of the story, and this slightly scary kind of authorial hand. It's the authorial hand there, this mystery narrator saying, "Little did they know," and phrases like that. So you're sort of being wary of that, which sometimes kind of creeps in, I think, when you're writing in third person. In terms of tense, I'll just quickly talk you through the advantages and disadvantages here. So if you're writing in present tense, the advantage is immediacy. It's a very good tense when you're trying to capture experience and the moment. It's effective, and it's very popular in particular genres. So, for example, a lot of young adult books, a lot of psychological thrillers, which are about experience, are written in this tense. And sometimes it can help to kind of bring the past closer. So Hilary Mantel, for example, who wrote kind of Wolf Hall, would use the present tense sometimes to write her historical fiction as a way of bringing the past kind of closer to the reader. The downsides of present tense, by comparison, it can feel a little bit claustrophobic, it can feel a little bit flat, and I think it's less useful and helpful when you're telling a story over time. So that that advantage you get with the immediacy in the here and now. If your story is being told over like sort of 3 or 4 years, for example, with flashbacks, then that's harder to do, I think, sometimes with kind of present tense. And in the same way with first person, third person, we've got a flip here. So when we go on to the positives of the past tense, this sometimes feels more natural. It's a more kind of traditional way of telling a story. So you all mediate into a tradition. It gives you a bit more depth into the telling. And as I say, it's a more useful way to tell a story over time. And the challenges here are in terms of creating distance. I think pace can be a challenge sometimes. I think sometimes writing in the past tense can feel a little bit slower. And again, there is that temptation to be authorial. And if we just flick on the next slide quickly, I will say if you've sort of got these 4 options, then you've got first person present, first person past, third person close present, and third person close past. And it's a sort of sliding scale, I suppose. The first person present is the most intimate and immediate, and the third person close past is the most distant with most space. And as I say, experiment with these and work out what works for you, because as I say, if you have to change your mind further down the line, it's a lot of work to unpick. Okay, I'm just going to talk quickly about the final P, because I do want to leave time for you to ask some questions. And this last P is place, so thinking about the setting of your novel. And this works in different ways. I think there's a couple of questions to ask yourself. Firstly, most naturally, where is your book going to be set? I think it sounds fundamental, but I think if you know that before you start writing, it really helps. And I think it helps firstly in terms of character. So quite often there's a link between who a person is and where they come from. So I think that is useful to have in there. Think too, if it's a real place, how you're going to research it. So David Nichols, kind of wonderful writer, wrote a piece where he talked about with his first books, he spent the time to go and visit the places, and then in later books he then used internet research for the locations. So if the places are real, think about, are you going to go and see them, and do that prep before you start writing. The second question, which I think people often overlook, is when your book is going to be set. Is it going to be in the here and now? Is it going to be in the past or the future, or in the near past or the near future? And all of those elements kind of make a difference. To give you a couple of kind of recent examples, do you want a world where you've had lockdown and coronavirus? I know some writers who have either sort of set novels kind of 5 years before or kind of 5 years later. They didn't want that in the mix. I think it's a question too of technology. It's a lot more difficult, I think, these days to sometimes with plots. If people have got mobile phones or access to the internet, can they be lost or trapped? If that's the kind of book you're writing in quite the same way. And then depending on the when, if it's set in the past, you're going to need to do research. If it's going to be set in the future, and then you're going to need to use your imagination a little bit more. A couple more questions very quickly on place before we finish up. Firstly, is your story world going to be real, fictional, or a mixture? So to give you a sort of example of each, The Day of the Jackal by Frederick Forsyth, kind of classic thriller about the attempted assassination of the French president Charles de Gaulle at the time, was very much set in Paris, and it worked because it was authentic and real and used real places very effectively. I was born in Salisbury, which is in the heart of Thomas Hardy's Wessex, and Wessex was a place where Thomas Hardy sort of transposed it onto real places, but it was a sort of fictional world, so it was sort of a composite of the two. And sometimes you will have writers who create fictional places inside real places. So there's a novel we look at on the course called In Our Mad and Furious City by Gigan and Ratney, which is set on a housing estate in northwest London. So the housing estate is fictional itself, but the London that surrounds it is real. So have a think about, do you want to have that authenticity of real places, or do you want to have a bit more space and freedom to have somewhere kind of fictional? And then the last question in terms of place is, how much detail do you need to know before you start? So think about, we've got a quote here I think we have from, oh yes, these ideas. So firstly, yes, first in terms of world building, if you're writing a science fiction or fantasy book, you may need to do a bit more planning and prepping than if you're setting your novel in contemporary London. Think about what sort of writer you are. So I know when I write first drafts that they tend to be quite dialogue heavy, and I put my description in more in the second draft. So I know I don't need to do too much thinking and planning in terms of place to begin with. And that goes back to that idea of kind of planning versus pantsing. Again, are you the kind of writer who will feel more comfortable with this detail, or are you happy to go with it and add that information in a little bit later on? So to sum up then, these are the 5 Ps I recommend thinking about before you start writing. So come up with that pitch. I think that's crucial. Think about the protagonist, particularly their motivations. Think about the plot, what kind of writer you are, how much planning you want to do. Help yourself by thinking about the point of view and tense before you start writing. And finally, have a little think about kind of place as well. And I think if you've got all those elements in there, then you'll be in a really good place to start writing. That finishes the main presentation, but I'm just going to finish up very quickly by talking, I think, Martin, about the novel course, if that's okay. And this is something that I've been teaching since we had our main start in September. And this is a 101-day course over 15 themed weeks. So the idea is that we want you to write a full manuscript, come out with a full draft from start to finish. And we have recorded a lot of videos. There's sort of 20 to 25 hours of videos in total. So you get a different video lesson Monday to Friday. And that's accompanied by a full lesson for a deep dive into each topic. We have an authors panel, 9 fantastic authors for different genres who talk about different writing topics each weekend. And we ask, or the recommendation is you're coming to this trying to write 5,000 words a week. And if you do that, then over the duration of the course, you should get a full manuscript down. And as you can see on the start dates, we've got one towards the end of this month, which is Time to Begin with NaNoWriMo, and then a kind of New Year course in January the 8th. I'll just show you this slide very quickly, which is the kind of the themes that we do. You can see there's a different kind of writing theme kind of each week that we focus on. The other elements of the course I think are really important to mention is that we have a series of masterclasses. So I teach a masterclass each Monday. And these are a mixture of either a kind of deep dive into different topics or live editing, or we have kind of guest authors. And these are just examples of some of the authors we've had kind of past and present. So it's a mixture there. You get a writing community that you join as well. We have Feedback Friday where you can share and give feedback to each other. So I think I'm really excited about the course. It's a great one to if you're interested in writing, getting stuck in. And as I say, get that prep in first. And if you do that, then you'll be in a great place to begin writing. Okay, thank you all for listening. I'm pleased to see the numbers haven't dribbled down to 0 whilst I've been talking away. So I'm going to take a sip of water. Whilst I think Martin is there, who's done valiant work